as we embark on this exciting journey through the UNCF Virtual Learning Series, Equity in Education, Advancing Opportunities for Black Teachers and Parents, I want to kick things off with a question. What does education mean to you? Take a moment to ponder as we delve into the heart of education today. I'm Nadrea Njoku, Assistant Vice President of the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute at UNCF, the driving force behind UNCF's commitment to sound research and data. I'm also your guide through this exploration. Today, as we step into the world of education, let's not just learn. Let's ignite conversation, challenge our perceptions, and most importantly, let's act. At FDPRI, we don't just study education, we shape its future. We equip UNCF with essential data to advocate passionately for historically Black colleges and universities. Our aim is to move beyond anecdotal stories, weaving a compelling narrative supported by robust data, creating a case for support that resonates. In collaboration with Donors Choose and the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, the UNCF Virtual Learning Series is more than a series of webinars. It's a journey into the transformative power of knowledge, ideas, and collaboration. Each session is meticulously crafted to spark dialogue, change perceptions, and inspire action. This groundbreaking series happens daily from February 12th to the 16th, addressing the crucial need for diverse teachers in our education system. It also delves into the challenges of recruiting and retaining skilled Black teachers. Here's a glimpse of what to expect. Monday, February 12th, Build for Equity, sponsored by ETS, Exploring Practices for Diversifying the Teacher Workforce, presented by Dr. Jamila Coase, Justin Minkle, and Lee Ann Erickson. Tuesday, February 13th, The Hard Work of Hard Work. Our newest report, sponsored by the Voya Foundation, highlights best practices from HBCU teacher education programs, presented by Drs. Keely Wett-Coppridge, Rayshan Davis, and Latasha Mosley. Wednesday, February 14th, Insights into the Black Male Educators Experience, the largest ever survey on male teachers of color, presented by Christina Steen Joy Lyles and Sharif El Mekki. Thursday, February 15th, Hear Us, Believe Us, Centering African American Parent Voices in K-12 Education, moderated by Sekou Biddle of UNCF. The panel will feature Dr. Meredith Anderson, Dr. Ashley Gilchrist, Maya Martin-Cadogan, Dr. Courtney Ijudan Taisi, and Cameron Frazier from Becoming Collegiate Academy. And Friday, February 16th, Reflecting on the Past, Present, and Future of Black Teachers, a fireside chat with Dr. Deanne Dans, facilitated by me, Nadrea Njoku. Now let's talk logistics. Today's event will unfold with presentations from our distinguished speakers, followed by a Q&A session. You can learn more about the presentations and the presenters on the Hoover app. Just download the app and log into our event. If you are using your desktop, a login link was sent to your registered email today at 11:30 a.m. We encourage you to bookmark this link in your browser for easy access. During the session, we encourage you to use the Q&A, chat, and communication features. At UNCF, we believe in the HBCU effect, an agenda that celebrates the rich legacy of historically Black colleges and universities. It's about more than just education. It's about community upliftment, empowerment, and breaking barriers. This series aligns with FDPRI's commitment to center HBCUs in the national conversation on Black teacher preparation. We know that the presence of Black teachers correlates with student success, and HBCUs play a critical role in this journey. Our research reports, like the inspiring Hard Work for Hard Work, and programming such as the virtual series, are a part of our commitment to bringing the HBCU effect to life. Thank you for being part of our UNCF Virtual Learning Series, a space where knowledge meets action.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Jamila Coates, and I am thrilled to be here with you today. I'm a board member of the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, as well as a member of the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. Today, I am so excited to talk to you today about some of the work that we have been doing around equity and specifically centering Black teachers and ensuring that we have built a good pipeline for them to enter the world of education. We welcome your questions throughout our presentation today, and you can put your questions in the Whova app or in the chat on whatever feels most comfortable for you. This work comes out of hard years and years of work, grassroots work and processing of what it means to have an equitable environment for educators, particularly Black educators. Since we've done this report, we've built coursework for educators, and we have spoken out nationally about ensuring that students have an opportunity to have an honest education, particularly from teachers of all backgrounds within their classrooms and within within society that they will meet with other students. So we invite you to ask questions throughout our presentation. This is the report. So out of this work comes an actual report. This report is for not only educators, but it is for HR people, it is for parents, it is for anyone that has any interest in the well-being of students. So this report you can access online. You can use this QR code or the URL that is printed below. And at the end, we will also show this again for you to be able to access this report. So again, my name is Dr. Jamila Coles. This work could not be done without some of our partners, ETS and the NEA Foundation. We are so grateful for their support and their financial backing in believing in the work of equity and ensuring that Black and Brown educators have a space within the classrooms. While we did this work, there was sort of an emotional encoding that we had to go back and dive through and think about what have we been taught by society and what are the ways that we need to undo some of that thinking. So we did that within the context of a team, and we did that within the context of bringing in lots of different educator voices. So throughout this report, you will hear the voices of other educators and other administrators and other people who have had the experiences of being Black in their current context and thinking about what it means to support also Black educators within their context. So I would like to introduce you to other members of our team today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Justin Minkle, and we all kind of wanted to start off with our why for this work. And for me, it goes back to that question that was on that very first video about what education means. And for me, it means that our job as adults is to help children to live the lives they dream. And that's what I tried to do, for 20 years as a mostly second grade teacher. All my experience was in high poverty public schools, and almost all of my students were students of color. At the same time, I noticed, what a lot of you have probably seen in different contexts, that the majority of their teachers were white, and that as you moved up the hierarchy, like to the principal and the superintendent and then the commissioner, the likelihood that those people shaping their education were white became increasingly high. And one thing I think about all the time, as a dad, as a teacher, is that kids spend so much of their lives in school. When I was teaching first, second grade, I got to see the kids more during the week than their own parents got to see them in terms of their waking hours. And that's this huge responsibility. And it means that we really have to shape school in a way that they can live those lives they dream. And we also wanted to share kind of our takeaway. My biggest takeaway from this report and all the research we did and conversations with educators is that the problems that confront teachers of color, educators of color in the system are often the same problems that afflict the teaching profession as a whole, right? So you have a lack of respect, exhausting work for low pay, and lower professional autonomy than it seems like the job of being a teacher should merit. Limited pathways for teachers who want to take on leadership roles, but also want to keep working directly with students. But the reality is that every single one of those problems afflicts teachers of color in a more acute way and a more widespread way. And so kind of my takeaway from that is that because that's true in terms of the acuteness, the solutions that we develop need to be specifically robust and targeted for teachers of color. So Leanne, what about your why and takeaway?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Leanne Erickson. My why really does go back to my journey to the work of racial equity in education, which is absolutely wrought with personal failure that led to immense learning and transformation. And if that story can be of encouragement or help to you, I would love to share it more deeply, and please feel free to reach out. But now that I'm here as an educator in Iowa, and I've been an educator in a lot of other places, I see the impact that a lack of a robust teacher pipeline has. I was just speaking with a woman named Marianne Coleman, who has been working for civil rights for the last 60 years here in Iowa. And she let me know that she is the only Black administrator in Iowa to retire from that profession in the last 100 years. In Iowa, our teaching population is over 94% white. And the University of Iowa, which is in the city that I'm in now, did not graduate one elementary educator of color in the winter of 2023. This is a problem for all students, and it's a particular problem for our students of color. And we know that statistically. And so my why is that it is to support and to change that reality so that our school system can work better for all students. And I would say my main takeaway from researching and talking with the incredible educators that we did and problem solving is that there are solutions to these problems, that this work is not hopeless, but rather filled with hope if we really can come together as a community for change. Statistics and critical data that really drove this work. And there are plenty of qualitative and quantitative data points that drove this work, but we just wanted to highlight a few of them. Black teachers are 2 times as likely to leave the profession than white teachers, according to a 2021 study. 1% of public school teachers in the US identify as white, and only 46% of public school students identify as white. And then in places like Iowa, that data obviously is even worse. 40% of America's schools do not have a single teacher of color on staff. Students of color who have one teacher of color before 3rd grade are 13% more likely to enroll in college. If they have 2, they are 32% more likely to enroll. So as we continue to think about the data, it's really important to look at the data, but also to listen, right? So to understand the people behind those numbers. And so we talked to a lot of teachers, and we wanted to take a moment here to lift up the voices of the experts in the field who are doing that work.
So this is a quote from Jennifer Walker, Teacher of the Year, who then became a curriculum supervisor in Ohio. It goes all the way back to K-12. Are we making school a safe and inviting atmosphere for kids so that they can see themselves doing that for their future students? How do we start to fix that all the way to preschool, kindergarten, up throughout the grade levels?
This quote comes from Lamont McAdoo, a high school teacher in Arkansas. When teachers are trusted to be the professionals that they are, when they have the autonomy to be and do as they see fit, and when the culture is one that is welcoming and inviting, those are the things that work, that make people want to come into the building.
When students of color choose the teaching profession, continued feelings of discrimination can lead to early attrition. Avoid diversity for diversity's sake. Once we hire the teachers, understand why we hired them and support them. And that's Dr. Marcus Balin, principal in Illinois.
And this last quote is from Shanna Peoples, Texas, and National Teacher of the Year 2015. What if we go to the community and ask them to send their best and brightest to become teachers? So on this next slide, you're going to see kind of the graphic that distills our model. And it's kind of like a wheel, you know, there are these 9 domains. These emerged from our research, but also from our conversations with educators. So there are a few things we wanted to share about this. First of all, today we will kind of walk you around this wheel, sort of like going around a clockwise. And these domains are sort of organized into starting this work, sustaining this work, and some of the structural supports that need to be in place to really make it feasible and sustainable. At the same time, though, this is not a sequence where you have to do all 9 steps in order, like putting together furniture from IKEA where you can't miss a step, right? Like you may choose 2 of these domains today to really focus on in your work over the coming months. So you might choose the student experience and the respect. And so these are really context dependent. And the way that this sort of wheel is structured is the structure that we also have in the report itself. And we can go to the next slide, please, Leanne. So the way that we structured what we wanted to share with you today really parallels the structure of the report itself, or sometimes we call it a guide for districts, for states, for individual teachers. So we're going to talk about each of these domains, and you'll see at the top, like we really try to distill everything we learned and heard to just a couple of sentences. It's sort of a thesis, right? So for domain 1, we really wanted to begin with students, with children, and center them. This was kind of our takeaway. Students of color are more likely right now to have a negative classroom experience, which makes them less likely to return to the classroom as teachers. Increasing the racial diversity of educators can flip this cycle. And for me, that was, I think, what was both the most daunting, but also the most hopeful about this work, is that there is that cycle that perpetuates itself, right? We know, this statistic on the left, and this is another component of each domain in the guide, right, is just some of the numbers and sometimes some case studies. Right now, about half of students in US public schools are BIPOC, but only about 18% of their teachers are. And that disconnect has real consequences, right, for the way kids feel in school, for the way they feel welcomed or feel kept out. This was another quote from Dr. Belen, the principal in Illinois, that really captured it. I thought, unless you can come back because you had a teacher who inspired you to be a teacher, you are not going to go back to a place where you have been traumatized. And then for each of these reports, we also kind of had this real action focus. And that's one thing we'll ask you to do today. As you ask questions, as you kind of make notes, is really think about the action piece. Like, what could you do over the coming months, over the coming year? And for us, so much of this really does begin with the experience of school for students of color. So when you kind of take that action lens, when it comes to the student experience, I think the reality is that this cycle is going to replicate itself one way or the other. And if we can make it a virtuous cycle where students of color feel loved and feel seen, some of them will then return to the classroom as teachers, as principals, as superintendents someday. And Dr. Jamila Coase is going to talk through domain 2.
So domain 2 was surrounded by access. So we all know that teaching comes with licensure requirements, as well as some level of schooling, college education. The licensure requirements and standardized assessment can act as a barrier to the profession for people of color and for people in general, but it disproportionately affects people of color. And that is largely because bias exists in all tests that we've created. We must remove that roadblock and facilitate access for prospective teachers. Now, this is not to say that we want to water down the rigor that we hope that our teachers have and bring into the classroom. We just want to make sure that we are not inadvertently barring people from the classroom who have different experiences that can be brought into the classroom to help students to have a better educational experience and to feel seen in ways that they might not otherwise feel seen. So some critical stats from that is that and we talked a little bit about these stats earlier, is that 78.2% of white test takers passed compared to 36.8% of Black test takers. So thinking about when we look at the ratios, when we look at the percentages of who is in the classroom, we can also look directly at these tests and see how that might be a barrier to making sure that Black teachers are in the classrooms. Another point that is extremely important to note is that from this principle, in Boston, we are surrounded by lots of colleges and universities with very strong teacher prep programs that are working to diversify their pools. The state tests have traditional pass rates that are very detrimental to people of color, which is to say that our colleges and universities are doing a great job of preparing teachers, but then once they get to this standardized test element, teachers may not be as successful. That's not to say that they are not prepared. It is to say that the tests are not reflective potentially of what is happening in our classrooms. It is also not to say that colleges and universities are doing all of the exact things, all of the right ways, all of the time. It is just saying that we haven't widened our lens to think about what education can be. And right now, some of the limits that we have bar people from even accessing education and the opportunities to teach students who need them.
All right, I have the job of talking about domain 3, which is affirmation. And when we talk about affirmation, I mean so much more than telling someone they did a good job, right? The kind of being known in a space, being listened to in a space, having the ability to change the space that you're in, that makes you want to stay there and build something. So we talked about the critical stat of representation among teachers of color. But as a result of that, white culture and white racialized identity are really embedded into our schools. And I think this quote from Dr. Carmelita Lamb speaks volumes to that reality. She said, "What is our capacity to support a diverse educator? What are the ways in which we are going to welcome that young Black teacher into our community, in the building? The environment in which teachers are teaching has a huge impact on their perception of whether they are making any kind of difference or whether there is value in what they can offer to children. It is very difficult to survive that if they do not have support." And an action item under this would be to offer professional development opportunities that are designed specifically with teachers of color in mind. That is one way to increase affirmation. So as we pause and reflect, we have the student experience, the access, and the affirmation. And we love for you maybe to write down in the Whova app or somewhere in your own personal journal or note-taking device. We'd love for you to consider your experience in K-12 school. How did it influence your desire to work in the field of education? So what was the direct impact of your K-12 experience to your desire to teach? What other experiences impacted your desire to work in education? We'll pause for just a few seconds for you to consider those questions. And remember, we would love to hear your questions as well. Go ahead and put those in the chat or on the app so that we can answer them at the end. Oh, thank you. Someone just let me know the chat is disabled. You can put your questions in the Q&A portion or in the Whova app. Thank you for letting me know that. And we invite you to continue pausing and reflecting as we go through the rest of the domains. Domain 4 is called the team, all right? Building that team within the school. And what are the elements of a good team? And affinity groups within schools can actually create a sense of community that combats the isolation that educators of color often feel and provides needed support and recognition, right? So a critical stat here as we were researching was teachers participating in the Black Teacher Project affinity group reported gaining insights that facilitated their healing and access to tools they could take back into the classroom. I really appreciated the juxtaposition of those two things, the healing and the tools, both of which are critical when we're talking about an education system that a person of color may have been hurt in as a young person or as a professional. When these kinds of particular relationships are fostered, they become transformational for teachers. And let's continue to lift up teacher voices. Often a barrier is going to an interview at a school and seeing no one that looks like you as a Black man or woman, and have it be all white people on the panel and just feeling like I don't necessarily want to work here because I don't feel like I have an affinity group or have a peer group or be able to have the kind of equity conversations that I want to have. If we're going to further equity in education, we do not want to silence voices. And so I think a key action item here would be to invite and equip key leaders to begin mentorship and or affinity group initiatives. Because when cycles of initiatives, when you're starting and stopping these things, teachers feel frustrated, they feel undervalued. Sustaining strong mentorship and affinity groups requires adequate training of teacher leaders, resources, monitoring, and responsive support. I know you'll get to hear from Sharif El-Mekki a little bit later in the week, and I just highly recommend connecting with the Center for Black Educator Development as a way, especially if you're working in the school or maybe there are only one or two educators of color. There are other groups like that you can help educators connect to build that affinity space to be able to share and grow in their unique giftings. So we talked about personal affirmation. We talked about affirmation within building a team. And now we're going to talk about affirmation from the outside and the impact that community has on teacher retention and hiring. How is the broader community impacting the experience of Black teachers? And our thesis for this section is the reciprocal support between a community and its school plays a critical role in hiring and retaining teachers of color. When a school is a place of community partnership, students will have a more positive experience and may consider returning as future educators. The community matters. And when the community is speaking out negatively against people or teachers of color, the school's response to that matters. Today, 40% of schools in the US do not have a single teacher of color on staff. And diversification attempts within the building or the curriculum can contribute to that statistic. Oh, pardon me. There we go. I'm sorry. Cultural affirmation of teachers of color in white communities is critical to retaining teachers of color and is often inhibited by tensions over academic and administrative policies. We know we're seeing this now in our political climate, in the context, but this isn't new. So as educators, as school districts, we need to develop a response and we need to strengthen partnerships with the community so that they are safe places for teachers of color to be. Again, I just returned to this quote, what if we go out into the community and ask them to send their best and brightest to become teachers? An important thing to do as you consider the community is really understand and address the narrative the community has about the school. Listen to those narratives and address the concerns. This is part of the critical support needed to ensure BIPOC educators are supported enough to continue teaching in that community.
Domain 5, we talked about the issue of gatekeeping and who the gatekeepers are. School leaders charged with hiring and staffing decisions directly impact the diversity of the educators within their schools. Those leaders must be held to a high standard of diversity and equity. Teachers of color are more likely to assume leadership roles within a school when they are supported by leaders of color. Anytime I talk about my journey through education, I always have this roadmap in my mind, and sometimes I have it on screen. At every point in my life where I was elevated and made to believe that I could really excel in the field of education, there was a Black educator who helped me to see that. At every point within my journey where I questioned whether or not I could really be effective in education, there was a non-white person, there was a non-Black person who was in that position. That's every single time. And that's not to say that I didn't have good white teachers or teachers not of color throughout my educational journey. I did. But the ones who were most impactful for me were my Black educators. In the chat, John Gadby also mentioned that he went into education because his Black teachers of color saw something within him. There is something critical about having a Black teacher to be able to see your teacher, see yourself in the field of education. Here's a critical stat. According to a Texas study by the American Research Institute, Black principal candidates were 18% less likely to be promoted to principal than an equally qualified white candidate. Not only is it important for educators of color to be in those positions, but it's also critical that educators of color have the opportunity to select other educators of color to be in those positions. And they can only do that if they are in those positions. When they are not in those positions, for whatever the case may be, it's important that we are able to invite them into that space so that this idea of gatekeeping can subside and that teachers and educators of color, Black educators in particular, can have an opportunity to access and give students the opportunity to be able to see themselves in the field of education. Think about the principals and executives in the school because every level matters. Think about who is in the cafeteria and who is cleaning. Is the other Black person picking up trash? So when we look at our own schools, when we look around at our own schools, are we seeing other teachers of color? Are we seeing people in administration that are teachers of or that are educators of color? Are the people in our HR positions educators of color? And are we inviting our parents and community members of color into our buildings in order to give us insights and ensure that we can see the blind spots that we have?
And I just want to mention a story as we go into the pause and reflect. In my current job, I work with student teachers at the school where I taught for 16 years. The school is almost all Latinx, like first and second generation immigrants, but out of collectively, about 40 interns or student teachers in this program, we only have 3 who are people of color, and they are all Spanish speaking themselves. It makes a huge difference for them connecting with students. One of those 3 scored a 61 on a praxis test that she needed a 63 for, right, in social studies. And that actually prevented her from becoming a teacher. And so just when we talk about kind of who decides, right, whether you advance to become a teacher, I think we need to think about what are the impact of those gatekeepers. For this pause and reflect, one of the things we really wanted to do in this guide is take on the issue of power directly. And one of the things that we noticed that in some ways kind of broke my heart a little is a lot of times you'd hear teachers use the word allow, right? Like my principal allowed us to have an affinity group. And if someone can allow you to do something, they can also disallow you to do that, right? Like they can take away that right. And so I think what we really need is people of color, people who believe in diverse educators actually in those positions of power, and we need to shape the system in that way. So our reflection for you that we'd love you to jot down some ideas or write on the Whova app is, in order for BIPOC teachers to stay and thrive in the system in which you work, what shifts in power, support, representation, and decision-making need to take place? So take about 1 minute to write your thoughts on that, and then I have one more thought on this piece. So just a note on this, one of the things we really realized through this report is that in a lot of ways, retention is harder than recruitment, because it's relatively easy, to recruit wonderful teachers of color who are willing to come into the profession. But if we don't change the systems that are driving them out, it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom, because those teachers leave, at a higher rate even than non-Black teachers of color, which is already a really, really high attrition rate, right? And so one of the things we really thought about that we'll get into in some of these later domains is the need to really restructure the system in terms of power, in terms of respect. And we go to the next slide, please, Leanne. So this is one of those things that I was talking about at the beginning, where we know that system-wide we have a problem with the ways we respect the work of teachers, but it does hit BIPOC educators harder, right? And so in order to really improve systems of professional autonomy and respect, we need those support systems for BIPOC teachers, like a lot of the things Leanne was just talking about, to be especially robust. And this quote really hit me from Christy Jackson, Arizona Teacher of the Year. The same things driving our teachers out of school are driving our students out of school. So we really need to look, and we're looking at the questions in the chat and we're kind of saving them for the end, but one of the strands that I was thinking about is when you talk about shaping professional development systems, for example, we need to make sure that there's not just representation in terms of teachers who are there, right, at the professional development, or teachers who are leading it, but who's actually making the decisions to shape those systems of professional development. And we need BIPOC teachers represented at every level, like school, district, state leadership teams, because again, like we see that disrespect that we see throughout the profession hit teachers of color particularly hard. On this next slide, it's really kind of connected in a lot of ways to the respect, is this idea of the resources. One of the things, and we go to the next slide, Leanne, one of the things that was really hopeful and also crushing at the same time, if that's possible, is to realize, first of all, that it is not our job to make the system perfect, but it is our job to make it better. And that while it's really hard to make the system the way it should be, and it takes huge shifts in structure, it's really easy to make it better than it is now, right? And part of that is because in a lot of districts we found people weren't even really setting goals at the school or district level for increasing the diversity of their teachers. In a lot of cases, they weren't really even capturing that data on the front end. So this piece about resources is really that idea that once we set those concrete goals, we then need to back it up. And if we're going to say that we believe in diversity, we need to actually put the funding to make that happen in terms of these projects. This was another quote from Dr. Marcus Boleyn, just being able to say, hey, I need this. Can I go to this conference? Can we develop this network? Can we start one where teachers of color in the country can get together? And one of the important things we found is that idea of affinity groups ideally happens at your school, but it's also really important when teachers of color do feel isolated to have a network that may be other teachers in the district. It may even be teachers throughout the state or nation. And that again, we need not only a plan, but the funding to make that plan actually happen. So our final piece, Dr. Jamila Coase will talk through. This is the big picture redesign.
So the radical redesign is what I call it because it is my absolute favorite domain. Now, I will say some days I wake up and I think about education and I'm like, just throw the whole system away and we can just start over and rebuild something completely different. And I think that if we did that, we could build something beautiful. But as our education system stands, I think about the incremental change that can be done within the systems that we already have. We know that we're going to have to push the envelope in some significant ways to make change. But in the meantime, there's some incremental change that we can make. Our thesis for this domain was we must redesign our education system to support teacher leadership and better meet students' needs. The rationale behind this is that educators have lots of ideas and what they don't have a lot of is time. They don't have a lot of time to implement those ideas, to engage with communities, to engage with students intentionally, and then to reflect on their own wellness and what it means to be an educator in our current society. Educators need all of that. They need the time, they need the tool, they need the tools, the training, the technical assistance. They need all of those things. And by redesigning our educational system and thinking about ways we push the envelope toward more teacher leadership and more autonomy for teachers can not only, as Justin was describing, recruit teachers, but also retain them. As a elder millennial educator, I think about my colleagues and their orientation to the classroom. And I think about how many of them are like, get me out of here. And I'm thinking about what is it that gives them the feeling that they want to get out, like they are trapped in this system that they can't get out of. And of course, there are those who love it and like love it every day. And most of them do love it every day, but there are parts of our system that needs to change if we expect that they will stick around. Having more flexibility in their schedule is critical, especially in our age of technology and having the ability to do lots of different things. Considering job sharing so that teachers don't have to be in the classroom all day, every single day. We like to joke about having summers off, but truly we know that educators are working during those summers and gaining lots of professional development. What does it look like to have teachers truly have a break from education so that because what they're going to do with that break is reflect on it anyway. So what does it look like to have them have the opportunities to do that intentional reflection during what we have structured as the traditional means of education? What does it look like to give them more autonomy, more time, more leadership opportunities, more say in how their school day goes and what students receive in their learning? How can we redesign education to meet the needs of our teachers better, who will absolutely ensure that the needs of our students are met in better ways? And our reflective question for that: how would you redesign the system in which you work to better meet the needs of students of color, families, and teachers? Even if you just come up with one thing, because I think one thing at a time we can make some really important change. But the thing that I think that is central to all of our domains and all of the ways that we hope people will engage and think and change is humility. humility has to be at the center of change. How can we step aside and use a different lens, particularly people who have change-making power directly? How can we be humble enough to think about things more dynamically? Right, Leanne, on you.
I feel like we need to take a collective breath. That was a lot of information, a lot of information synthesized from a lot more information for you. So if you just need to pause and take a breath right now, I just invite you to do that. You know, what Jamela said is so true. Humility is at the center of this work. And also a recognition that this work creates tension is important. Recognizing those tensions, naming those tensions, discussing those tensions in our teams is one way to reduce burnout, to increase retention. I cannot claim any credit for this resource. This was given to me by another incredible educator mentor, friend of mine, and this resource is linked for you at the end. It's an article that talks about the specific tensions when you talk about race and education. And so you might be feeling right now a lot of personal tension. We often, I know I do this, routinely question our own personal readiness to become the type of individual who can successfully engage in issues of race and racism in our lives. We think, what can I do? And that can be a tension that stops us from doing anything. Maybe you're feeling some structural tension where we routinely question the power that we as an individual have to actually counteract any structural or societal problems of racial and race class inequality in our lives. We think, what can I do against these giant systems? And maybe that stops us. Or maybe you're experiencing strategic tension, where we're routinely searching for concrete, actionable steps we can take in our spaces, questioning how abstract ideas or theories about racial inequality and the difference can help them. You think, what can I do? So whether you're at what can I do, what can I do, or what can I do, or maybe you're some combination of all three, talking through these tensions, voicing them, and considering what steps we can take to work through them instead of letting them be a barrier to the work is a really healthy way to be in this work, to recognize the tension.
And this is kind of, I think, along those same lines of there's so much that could be done. There's so much that could make things better, and really trying to focus in on what you want to do. So this graphic we found to be useful and to think about in the middle, what are those discretionary spaces where you could make the change tomorrow, right? So as a mostly second grade teacher, I could greatly diversify the books in my classroom library, the read alouds, the guest speakers. That's something that I could do immediately. What are the policies that you could change with collective advocacy? And I think for most of us, a lot of this work does kind of live in this middle circle with that idea. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So for example, like for a while, Arkansas was an English only state where I teach, right? And so you technically could not do anything to support and affirm students who spoke Spanish or Marshallese or other languages. That's a policy that can be changed, but takes collective advocacy. And then even that outer ring, if there are policies beyond your scope that is not realistic for you to take on, we can still reflect on how that impacts our students on a day-to-day basis and do what we can to support them within those sort of inner spheres of that model. We can go to the next slide, Leanne. Thanks.
So when we engage in work to diversify the pipeline, we have to consider multiple angles in order to prevent our own biases and experiences from dominating the decisions that we make. Because we have biases, we have experiences that will impact. So there cannot be only one lens from which we look and examine our own spaces and then consider what to do next, right? So we've created a process that can help you know what to do next. And what we would ask if you, and this is something that you can take back to your team, is choose a domain you'd like to work on. Choose a place to start. Like Justin said, you don't have to work on these in order. You don't have to work at them all at once, but maybe choose one domain to start, and then choose multiple lenses through which you will examine that domain. So think about who you should talk to. And maybe a better way to say this is, who should you be listening to? And I would consider I would offer for your consideration that you actually talk to your team about what active listening really looks like, about what listening to understand really looks like before you even delve in to speaking to teachers, parents, administration, community members, and organizations. Think about which current practices you would re-examine when considering that domain, whether it's hiring or curriculum or discipline or professional development opportunities. Think about what the data is saying, but not only what the data is saying, think about which data you're really looking at. Is that data telling the full story? I've gone into multiple spaces to support equity work, and they have this incredible equity goal, but they're still looking at the exact same data that they've looked at for the past 25 years. So they will have no idea how to measure whether or not their goals for a more equitable learning experience are actually happening, because they have no plans to collect data on those action steps. Make sure you are collecting the data that tells the whole story. Think about what you need to collect. And what are your current policies? What do you post on your website? What do you post in your handbook, in the syllabus? What do you say to family and community in communication to them? What do you put on your social media feed? How is that telling your story? Is that telling your whole story? And is it impacting the domain that you're looking at? Is it impacting the hiring, the recruitment, the hiring, and the retention of educators of color? So here's a QR code to just a simple doc that you can take right to your team. And then one recommendation is that once you've collected this information, consider what you will do. Create a 30, 60, and 90-day action plan. This link is also at the end of the slide deck.
So here are just a few resources that we would love for you to be able to check out just as you think about how you would build for equity within your context. As Dr. Njogu said at the beginning, this is about action. So it is great to talk about all of the ways we hope to do this thing, all of the ways we believe it can be done, but what action steps are we taking? How do we anchor this in action? So here are some resources to guide that work. And here are some other programs that are helping to diversify the workplace that we encourage you to check out as well.
And then we just wanted to mention, we've been kind of following along in the chat. And so we'll take some time for questions now, but you're also welcome to reach out later. So this was a question. I had a couple of thoughts, but I'd really love to hear Dr. Coase and Leanne what you think. Teresa L. Crenshaw Hammonds asked a couple of wonderful questions, but one of them was, are there policies we can use to reimagine K-12 education? And there was a question that in my mind was kind of connected to that about professional development that I'd like to touch on as well, that Swati Mehta asked. As we know, PD for educators are often not sustainable. How can we make PD meaningful and sustainable for teachers of color? So I just want to offer an initial thought. One thing I've thought a lot about is that I think there's a difference between the content and then the actual pedagogy or the structures, right? And I think about it like my iPhone. Like my iPhone has all these apps on it, right? And that's kind of the content, like the books on our shelves, the curricula we use, but there's also an operating system. And I think in a lot of ways in our schools, the operating system is really Eurocentric, right? Is white supremacist, like is designed in a way that feels really, really comfortable for white people and kind of, I think, decenters Black and brown students. So that's one thing I think about, right? Like when we look at this change, are there ways that not only can we make sure that we're diversifying content and curriculum, but we're really looking at like the way that we actually do things. But Dr. Coase, as soon as I saw that question about reimagining, I thought of you. So I wondered if you have thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I think I'll come back to that. Well, I think that question is truly large scope. I would say reimagining education comes from thinking about what do Black educators specifically, if that is the context that you are focused on, what is it that they want? What is it that they desire from their work environment? And are we just asking that question? Because if you ask me, I've got a lot of answers, right? Like I would like to be able to use my time differently. I would like to be able to engage with students outside of the classrooms, more home visits, that sort of thing. So for me, it would be different than it would be for a Black educator in a different context. And I think it's important to understand what perspectives that educator is bringing in as they're thinking about how to redesign schooling for their specific context. And with that, I think there was another question in the chat that was related to BIPOC and the use of BIPOC. The reason that we use BIPOC in this particular piece is because different contexts demand different things. So I am in Atlanta, I'm in Georgia, and in Atlanta, we have a lot of Black teachers, Black and brown teachers in many of our, Black teachers specifically, in many of our schools are present. We have them. But I know that, and that's in our metro areas. Once we move outside of the metro areas, we still sort of have them. We just need to disperse them a little bit differently. But I know as we move states, and this report was a national report, I know that different states have a different sort of need. So the inclusion of Indigenous educators, we talked specifically to our colleagues in Montana, and they were talking about the need for preserving their Native American land and making sure that students had Indigenous teachers of color. So the report is national, which is why we have used the broader term of BIPOC, and we invite people to pick which element of BIPOC educators they would like to focus on within their context as they think about their redesign and they think about how to build for equity within their context.
Justin, I'd really love to jump back to that question that was raised about PD and making them meaningful and for educators of color and making them meaningful for the educators in your building. I think when we look at what we've researched and what we look at the research tells us about affirmation, about the team, about the community, it's key that the professional development needs to be rooted in relationship. You would be absolutely right that if you bring someone in for a 3-hour professional development on equity, you will not move the needle. You won't. And so you have to think about sustainably, what can you do, not just sustainably, but consistently, that also has goals for outcomes. So if I'm going to hold a semester-long professional development, then at the end, you better believe that there's going to be a curriculum redesign or a system redesign that comes as a result of it. And you better believe that I'm going to invite and compensate, if we can, invite community members in to do that work with us, right? To make sure that the people doing the work, that the people who are part of the professional development are representative of maybe the community you serve, the people you'd like to bring into the fold of your community. I think that's really key. So these one-off 3-hour equity sessions just don't move the needle. I'm going to put, I think you can see, well, I don't know if you can see the chat. I'm going to recommend a book called Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, The Keys to Successful Equity Implementation. It talks a lot about creating the kinds of systems of equity that are sustainable and actually move the needle instead of taking you from this cycle of incident of inequity and injustice, response, momentum, end of momentum, silence, incident. Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, Keys to Successful Equity Implementation is a phenomenal resource, I think, that will address that. And making sure that you find your champions in your school to lead that. That has to come from within. The fire has to be lit from within.
There's another great question, also from Teresa. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing it right. L. Crenshaw Hammonds. Why can college professors have sovereignty over their classrooms, but K-12 educators cannot? And that was really interesting to me because, I spent 20 years as a second grade teacher, and I found that K-12 teachers actually had very, very little autonomy and were too micromanaged. And now I'm kind of working in higher ed and I'm seeing the other extreme, right? Like there's an expectation of a very, very high degree of autonomy. But that was one thing we thought about when we were talking about kind of like the respect element in particular, is just how important professional autonomy is. Sometimes I think about this metaphor that sometimes it feels like teachers are the crops, but teachers need to be the farmers, right? Like sometimes it's like, people come in and like use the curricula we develop or kind of like feature videos about teachers doing certain things. We're supposed to implement policies, but it's so important to have teachers actually shaping the policies, teachers shaping systems of professional development. And again, like that's one of those things that's cross-cutting throughout the profession, but I think we see it in a particularly acute way when it comes to Black and brown teachers in terms of really being in the power positions, again, where we don't have to use this word allow to do something like an affinity group or to diversify the curriculum, or some of the even low-hanging fruit about kind of making sure that the books in the classroom and the guest speakers and the videos are really reflecting multiple identities and not just kind of reinforcing whiteness. Dr. Coase or Leanne, did you have other thoughts on that question or other questions you wanted to highlight?
There's one here for Dr. Coase that says, Dr. Coase emphasized the importance of all levels mattering. Can we cultivate alignment across various sectors at the district level?
Absolutely. And I think that starts with the leadership in the building and their willingness to engage in that work. So I think it is absolutely possible, which is why, and I think that people who have often been forced into the margins have a different lens for being able to make sure that spaces are more inclusive of educators and people who support education at all levels, which is another critically important element of why we need diverse people. But I think it's absolutely possible with the right leadership.
Yeah, and Tiffany Jackson, I thought had a really great point. Educating members of the communities to understand that equitable practices are not implemented to disenfranchise majority populations, but to correct the effects of inequitable policies that have created generational inequities. And I think this is a complicated thing, like as a white person, thinking about this, because in one way, I think it's really easy sometimes to sort of center whiteness as though white students are the client. And you see that with a lot of these, under the guise of parents' rights, like really attacking even just the presence of books about Black people, by Black people in classrooms. At the same time, I think it is important to really make that case that talking about the diversity of the world, talking about truths about history, is not a bad thing for white students, right? And I know for me, like I didn't realize till I did Africana studies in college, how much had been missing from my upbringing and my education. And I feel like it was incredibly valuable to me as a person and as a learner to suddenly learn not only about new content in terms of like history and art and literature, but really redefining even the notion of what is history, right? What is art? And so I do think it's really important to make that case, that talking about truth, talking about diversity is not harming white students, but at the same time, white students are not the sole client of education.
And I would just echo that with teachers as well. Talking about diversity, talking about equity, having teaching our history to white teachers is also really critical, and I think a critical part of creating the kind of system where BIPOC educators can thrive and build alongside, right? Yeah.
And I'd like to add to that. I think John Gabay also put one of his questions or one of his statements was that compensation matters. So historically, Black and brown people have not had, particularly Black people in our country, have not had a great degree of the financial security that white counterparts have had. Money matters in the jobs that we decide to take on. And I think that we need to talk about that and say and name that Black and brown educators and Black educators in particular are doing a lot of heavy lifting throughout their job, and they should be compensated well for it. All teachers in general should be compensated for it, but we know the history of finances in our nation. So we need to ensure that if we want to retain teachers, that we are compensating them appropriately. And right now we're not. We're just not compensating teachers at the level that they should be compensated at, and that matters. So we also think about how we, the autonomy and the access and all of the things, but we also need to think about the compensation and if whether or not the compensation that we are giving is actually going to allow people to want to stay in the classroom, or is it forcing them out of the classroom? Or even giving them an interest in wanting to stay initially.
Yeah, and we wanted to end on this image. And the last thing I want to say before we discuss this is just that it was such an honor to be part of this work with all of you. One thing we've found, like when Dr. Coase and I developed this kind of equity course that she really built the architecture for with teachers, is that the community matters so much. So I hope all of you will keep reaching out to each other, reach out to us. It's just so important to have kindred spirits in this work. So this final image we wanted to end on was, Jacob Philadelphia, who was 5 years old at the time, going to the White House, and he asked kind of shyly if Barack Obama's hair was like his. And to me, this image says so much about the work we're doing, because children need to see themselves in the adults who care for them. And they need for the people who shape their classrooms and schools where they spend so much of their lives to understand their identities, their experiences, their struggles, their joys. And that's really what this work is all about. Thank you all. It's such an honor to do this work alongside you.